Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am so glad you could join us today because we are taking a massive deep dive into a topic that honestly changes how you look at the entire world.
Yeah, it really does.
Usually when we look at a map of the world, we just see a whole bunch of rigid lines.
Mhm.
We see borders, we see nations categorized by bold colors, and we see capital cities marked with those little stars.
Right. It looks so permanent.
Exactly. Absolutely. There is this inherent expectation of human control embedded in cartography. Like engineering. You draw a line, you build a fence, and the politicians in those capital cities just point and say, this is ours, we built this, we maintain it, and we dictate what happens inside these lines.
It looks very binary, very clean. Yours or mine. It looks like a closed system of human authority.
Yeah.
And it is comforting to the human mind. We like things to be visible, to be categorized. But most of all, we like to believe that human beings are sitting firmly at the steering wheel of history, calling the shots.
Right, that we are determining the future based on our own political acumen or, military might.
Spot on. But then you step into the biblical theology of divine providence, and suddenly that whole political map is turned completely upside down.
It really is. We are looking at a geopolitical landscape that is governed by an invisible, absolute sovereignty, and it shatters all our assumptions about human control. The real CEO of history isn't elected.
No, he is not.
So how does God actually govern these empires? And more to the point, why does it matter for the chaotic news we watch today? That is our mission today. We are unpacking two phenomenal texts. Israel's divine king is king of the nations, and Providence, Israel's divine king and his sovereign rule over the nations.
Those texts are incredibly dense, but so rewarding.
They really are. And right out of the gate, to set our theological framing for you listening, both of us approach this material as Protestant Christians. We adhere to the Westminster Confession, and we find incredible joy in the Reformed doctrines of God's absolute sovereignty.
We do. And before we jump into the details, we actually set a conversational rule for this script today.
Yes, we did. Because these concepts are so massive, we agreed beforehand. No interruptions. We are going to let each other finish our thoughts completely.
Right, so we can really flesh out the arguments of the text.
So to start, the source material begins by addressing a great and dangerous delusion that infects the human heart.
Which is the belief that man is the master of his own destiny. The world constantly asserts that authority resides in the ballot box or, in the nuclear silo or in the size of a standing army.
Or in secular philosophy.
Right. But the texts we are examining declare that God's authority operates in an entirely different category. What's fascinating here is that his authority is inherent in his self-identification.
Like at the burning bush.
Yes, when he says from the burning bush, I am who I am, he establishes that kingship belongs to him by his very nature. It is not acquired. He did not campaign for the position. He did not conquer another deity to get it. And he certainly does not rule by the consent of the governed.
That is a staggering reality check.
It is. Biblical providence is not describing a weak deity who sits back, observes human history, and then reacts to it. The Creator does not wait for human recognition to start ruling. Every single crown on this earth is borrowed.
Every single one.
Earthly sovereignty is derivative, it is provisional, and it is entirely accountable to the throne of heaven.
Okay, let's unpack this with a mental picture, because this changes the mechanism of how we view the news. Imagine a middle manager at a massive multinational corporation.
I like this analogy.
This guy walks around his specific office floor, assigning tasks, making demands, and acting like he owns the entire company.
Yeah.
He has genuine delegated authority over his specific department. He can hire, he can fire, he can allocate budgets.
But he is missing the bigger picture.
Completely. He is totally oblivious to the fact that the CEO, the actual owner of the building, the one who signs his paychecks, the one who built the company from the ground up, can reassign him, demote him, or terminate his position at any given moment.
That is precisely how earthly rulers operate.
Right. They strut across the world stage, boasting about their military strength or their economic policies, assuming their authority originates from within themselves. So for you listening right now, consider how often you view political figures as the final arbiters of history.
We do it all the time.
How often do we panic because we think the middle manager is actually the CEO? The texts challenge us to see right through this illusion. The pomp of crowns and the pride of empires are just borrowed greatness. They function on a ticking clock established by the actual owner of the building.
Taking that idea further, if we apply that reality of divine kingship to the actual origin of the nations we see on that world map you mentioned earlier, the implications alter our entire understanding of sociology.
And history, really.
Absolutely. If God is the supreme king, how did the current geopolitical landscape with all its various nations, languages, and borders actually come to be? The texts point us directly to the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11.
And to the Apostle Paul's sermon in Athens in Acts chapter 17.
Right. The existence of distinct nations is a direct product of divine decree. It was executed specifically to restrain human pride. It was not a random sociological drift or a byproduct of ancient human migration patterns.
Acts 17:26 is so clear on this.
It states that God determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of every dwelling place. Every single border drawn on a map and every era of national dominance operates under direct divine government.
He made from one man every nation of mankind.
Yes, he did this to organize history according to his own wise counsel, fracturing the monolithic rebellion of humanity at Babel into distinct linguistic and geographical groups.
I hear you saying God set those boundaries in a lot of those periods, but I want to push back on the implications of that just a bit.
Sure, let's hear it.
How does that actually play out in real time? If a dictator invades a neighboring country, slaughters innocent people, and annexes their land, it feels hollow to just say, well, God ordained the boundary change.
It is a difficult reality to process.
How does the source text handle the sheer tragedy of that? Human history is basically one long, bloody dispute over where those lines on the map should be drawn. Does the source imply that all border changes, invasions, and conquests are God's will?
That is the crux of the issue.
Because that sounds like it could easily slip into a kind of fatalism where we just shrug at aggression and say it was meant to be.
That is the crucial tension of Reformed theology, and the source texts address this by explaining the mechanism of concurrent providence. The text clarifies that God governs the actions of his creatures and orders every single event, yet he does so without being the author of sin.
Right.
When a nation invades another out of greed or malice, that human action is undeniably wicked. The dictator and the invading army are sinning, and they will face the absolute justice of the judge of all the earth. However, simultaneously, that very act of human rebellion cannot step 1 millimeter outside the sovereign decree of God.
It is a tough needle to thread.
It is. So think of an author writing a sprawling, complex novel. Within the narrative, a villain freely chooses to commit a crime based on his own wicked desires. The character is fully responsible for his actions within the story.
Because he is making real choices.
Right. But the author is entirely in control of the overarching narrative arc, using that character's wicked choice to bring about the ultimate resolution of the book. God uses the sinful actions of nations to accomplish his holy purposes, whether for judgment against a corrupt society, for the preservation of his people, or for the unfolding of his redemptive plan.
The human actors are fully responsible for their motives.
Yes.
But the historical outcome is governed by divine providence.
Yes. Isaiah chapter 10 is the perfect example of this mechanism. God calls the wicked empire of Assyria the rod of my anger. He uses Assyria as a literal axe in his hand to judge the rebellious Israelites.
But the text in Isaiah explicitly says that the king of Assyria does not intend to be God's instrument.
Exactly. Yes, precisely. The king's mind is focused only on destruction and greed. So God uses the king's wicked ambition to accomplish divine judgment, and then God turns around and judges the king of Assyria for his wicked ambition.
The author and the novel analogy clarifies the mechanism perfectly. It resolves the tension between God's sovereign control and human moral responsibility.
It is a massive conceptual shift.
So, within this globally governed theater where God is directing the rise and fall of these empires, he chose one specific nation to act as the focal point of his redemptive plan. We are talking about Israel.
And the text makes it very clear that Israel was an ethnic, political, and geographic nation.
They had visible borders, they had standing armies, and they had earthly kings. Their interactions with the surrounding superpowers like Egypt, Canaan, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, these were not just incidental historical details taking place in the background.
No, this was the very theater of divine providence.
Right. If we look at Egypt, the plagues were not just random magic tricks designed to scare a stubborn king. The source material argues they were highly calculated acts of divine kingship, demonstrating absolute superiority over the greatest empire of the region.
The Egyptian plagues are a masterclass in the systematic dismantling of a human authority structure. The Egyptians worshipped a massive pantheon of deities, and they believed these gods controlled the natural order.
Which was the basis of their entire civilization.
Right. More than that, they believed Pharaoh himself was a divine intermediary. When the God of Israel turns the Nile River into blood, he's not just ruining their drinking water, he is executing judgment on Hapi, the Egyptian god of the Nile, showing that the supposed lifeblood of Egypt answers to Yahweh.
And the darkness is another one.
Yes, when the sky goes dark for 3 days, God is directly humiliating Ra, the supreme sun god of the Egyptian pantheon. Pharaoh is an instrument in this grand theological demonstration.
His stubborn resistance, his hardened heart, actually magnified God's glory because it provided the necessary occasion for God to dismantle the Egyptian belief system piece by piece.
God showed the ancient world that he ruled the river, he ruled the weather, he ruled the livestock, and he ruled life and death itself.
What strikes me there is the sheer scale of the confrontation. God is not acting like a localized tribal deity trying to sneak his people out the back door. He is stepping onto the main stage of the ancient world and taking on the reigning superpower at the height of its strength.
It was a very public display.
And the texts stress that this pattern continues throughout the Old Testament. The God of Israel is the Lord of Babylon. He is the Lord of Assyria. Later in history, we see Persia, specifically under King Cyrus, functioning as the unexpected vehicle of restoration.
God actually named Cyrus through the prophet Isaiah over a century before Cyrus was even born, calling him his anointed.
Which is just wild to think about. Cyrus was a pagan Persian king, yet God funded the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem using the treasury of the Persian Empire.
That historical reality proves there is no such thing as secular history in the biblical worldview. Public history is ethically charged. Every political move, every military campaign, and every dynastic shift is bound up with the moral government of God.
It is all connected.
When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he did so for his own geopolitical advantage. He wanted to expand his empire and solidify his legacy. But from the perspective of divine providence, Cyrus was simply the designated instrument to release the Jewish exiles so they could return to Jerusalem.
And prepare the geographic and ethnic stage for the eventual arrival of the Messiah.
Right. The kings of the earth are playing their own games of conquest, but God is moving them like pieces on a chessboard to accomplish his eternal redemptive plan.
If we translate this for you listening right now, geopolitical history is highly theological. It is not just about economics, supply chains, or natural resources. It is about God's moral government.
That is a very humbling thought.
God uses foreign, unbelieving rulers who have zero desire to honor him to accomplish his holy purposes. That concept shifts the ground beneath our feet. And to see this providence in granular detail, the texts zoom in on the Babylonian Empire, specifically in the book of Daniel.
Daniel chapter 4 and chapter 5 are presented as inspired case studies.
Yes, case studies on how God handles human arrogance. Let's start with Nebuchadnezzar. He is the archetypal arrogant ruler. The text sets the scene. He is walking on the roof of his royal palace, looking out over this massive, wealthy empire.
And Babylon was a marvel of ancient engineering. We are talking about the famous hanging garters, the massive defensive walls, the Ishtar Gate.
Nebuchadnezzar looks at all of this, and he boasts in his own majesty. He claims he built it by his own mighty strength and for his own glory. And instantly, a voice falls from heaven, and his authority is stripped away.
The mechanism of his humbling is absolutely fascinating. The text says he was driven from human society and given a beast's mind.
It sounds terrifying.
It is. He lived out in the fields, eating grass like an ox, his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails became like bird's claws. The psychological and physical transformation of Nebuchadnezzar is a graphic illustration of a deep theological truth.
Which is?
When a ruler, or any human being, rejects the Creator's rule, they do not elevate themselves to godhood, which is the lie of human pride. Instead, they descend into an animalistic state. True humanity is found only in submission to God.
To reject God's kingship is to become less than human, to become brutish and irrational.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Nebuchadnezzar lost his reason because human reason is dependent on acknowledging reality. And the ultimate reality is that God is king.
That distinction between the lie of godhood and the reality of becoming a beast is staggering. And the fascinating part is that his humbling was redemptive. At the end of those 7 periods of time, his reason returned to him the exact moment he literally lifted his eyes to heaven and acknowledged that the Most High rules the kingdom of men.
He was restored to his throne, but he was a changed man.
But then, the literary pattern in the book of Daniel shifts to show us the absolute tragedy of a heart that remains hardened despite witnessing this exact kind of providence. We move to Belshazzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's descendant.
Belshazzar sinned against known light. He knew what happened to his predecessor. He knew the God of heaven could humble kings.
Yet he responded foolishly and suicidally. While the Medo-Persian army is literally encamped outside the walls of Babylon, laying siege to the city, Belshazzar decides to throw a massive drunken feast.
The historical context of that feast makes his actions even more brazen. Belshazzar felt secure behind the massive walls of Babylon. He believed his empire was impenetrable.
So, to project absolute confidence to his nobles, he deliberately brings out the sacred vessels, the golden cups and bowls that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the Jerusalem temple decades earlier.
He and his guests drink wine from them while praising gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. He is taking the holy items dedicated to Yahweh and using them in a pagan ritual of self-congratulation.
Let's find an analogy to capture the sheer arrogance of that moment. It is like a modern corporate hostile takeover. Imagine a ruthless billionaire buys out a beloved historic company, completely ousts the founder, and then on live television specifically chooses to drink his morning coffee out of the ousted founder's personalized, customized mug.
That paints a very clear picture.
It is not just about needing a cup to drink from. It is a highly calculated, public act of psychological dominance.
Yeah.
It is designed to say, I own you. Your legacy is my plaything. Belshazzar is holding a cup dedicated to the temple of the living God, praising lifeless idols.
And the prophet Daniel's brought in, and he tells the king straight to his face, "The God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored."
That is a chilling sentence. God is literally supplying the oxygen in Belshazzar's lungs at the exact moment Belshazzar is using that breath to blaspheme him.
The audacity of it is met with immediate, terrifying judgment. The handwriting appears on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, parson, weighed, measured, and found wanting.
The illusion of his impenetrable fortress was shattered.
That very night, the Medo-Persian army diverted the Euphrates River, marched under the walls of Babylon through the dry riverbed, and terminated the empire. Belshazzar was killed.
The contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar is deliberately stark. One king is humbled and restored, another king is proud and destroyed.
Together, these case studies prove that the breath and the ways of every king, whether they acknowledge it or not, are entirely in the hand of God. The physical walls of Babylon could not stop the decree of heaven.
Now, having established how God ruled over a specific geopolitical nation in the Old Testament and how he orchestrated the empires around them, the source material shifts the discussion to how this theology applies to the current era.
We move from national Israel to the multinational church.
But before we get to the modern application, we have to look back at the original promise made to Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a multitude of nations.
For centuries, that promise carried a mystery. How could the father of one specific ethnic nation, Israel, simultaneously be the father of a multitude of nations?
The Apostle Paul unpacks this in Romans chapter 4. He points out that this promise was a prophetic guarantee of the inclusion of non-Jewish nations through faith in the Messiah.
The texts maintain a clear dispensational distinction here.
Let's break that term down for the listener.
For the listener who might not have a seminary background, a dispensational distinction simply means recognizing that God structured his relationship with his people differently in the Old Testament versus the New Testament.
Right.
In the Old Testament, the people of God were synonymous with the nation-state of Israel. They had physical borders, a physical temple, and civil laws governing their society. But in the New Testament, with the arrival of Christ, that structure changes drastically.
The visible people of God are no longer confined to a single ethnic, political, or national identity. The church is not a nation-state.
We do not have a capital city on earth, we do not have a standing military, and we do not have an earthly king sitting on a physical throne.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text says our citizenship is in heaven. The church is not a political state. This shift proves that God was never an exclusively national deity. His plan was always global from the very beginning.
The ethnic boundaries of ancient Israel were never intended to be the final chapter.
They were the historical vehicle designed to bring the Messiah into the world, to preserve the scriptures, and to demonstrate the holiness of God. Once the Messiah arrived, the vehicle had fulfilled its primary function.
The implications of this structural shift are massive for how believers live today. Because the church is not a geopolitical nation, she is a pilgrim people sent out into all the nations.
Her warfare is not physical, it is spiritual.
Her expansion is not achieved by drawing new boundary lines on a map, forming political action committees, or conquering territory with a sword. Her expansion is achieved exclusively by gospel proclamation.
She bears witness to Christ in the midst of countless different languages, governments, and cultures.
But we must clearly state that this change in the form of God's people does not mean God has stopped governing the nations. The same Lord who ruled over Babylon and Assyria is still governing all modern rulers.
Raising up kingdoms, restraining evil, and directing the course of current history.
His kingship is just as comprehensive today as it was in the days of Daniel. The stage is the same, but the covenant community is now scattered across the globe, united by faith in Jesus Christ rather than by physical borders.
And that entire thread of Old Testament kingship demands a perfect king. We saw human kings in Israel, guys like David and Solomon, who were given tremendous privilege and covenant promises.
But they were deeply flawed, they were mortal, they compromised, they sinned grievously.
David committed adultery and murder. Solomon allowed his foreign wives to lead him into idolatry, building high places for false gods right outside Jerusalem.
Their failures were actually pedagogical. They taught Israel to long for a greater ruler. They proved that no normal human being, no matter how wise or well-intentioned, could bear the weight of a perfect, eternal kingdom.
Every time a human king failed, it pointed forward to the necessity of a divine king.
This leads us directly to the Christological fulfillment. Jesus is the son of David. He is the root and the descendant. The texts declare him to be the true King of Kings who will rule the nations with a rod of iron.
In Jesus, the absolute kingship of God and the specific earthly kingship promised to the line of David finally meet in perfect unity.
Christ is the prophet who perfectly interprets the divine will, speaking in nothing but the truth. He's the priest who ransoms a people from every tribe, language, and nation by offering his own blood as the perfect sacrifice for sin. And he is the king who rules with absolute sovereignty over all creation.
But that raises a massive question. If Jesus is ruling right now as King of Kings, why does the world look so chaotic?
This raises an important question indeed.
How should believers view Christ's current rule when we see wars, corruption, and massive injustice on our news feeds every single day?
The source texts argue that all of human history is currently subordinated to his return. He is gathering his redeemed from the ends of the earth right now and granting them entrance into his invisible, eternal kingdom.
Every geopolitical event, every rise and fall of modern nations, every shifting border is being orchestrated behind the scenes to facilitate the gathering of this multinational church.
History is not drifting aimlessly. It is moving with absolute precision toward the day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
Bringing all this theology of providence directly into your daily life, into the modern societal debates we see everywhere, requires us to look at the practical application of these doctrines.
The texts call for the total annihilation of human autonomy. The breath of every politician, every tech billionaire, every tyrant on the news today is held firmly in God's hand, just as Belshazzar's breath was.
Now, the authors take a very specific and controversial stance on modern social movements, and we need to report on their argument accurately. We are not endorsing any side here, just conveying what the text argues.
Right. Our goal is to present the source material's perspective.
The source material explicitly refutes what it calls the false refuges of today. It specifically names liberal theology, the social gospel, and critical race theory.
The text's argument is that these modern frameworks make a fundamental theological error. They seek to build an earthly utopia through secular pragmatism, and they attempt to find human identity in social grievances rather than in Christ.
Regardless of where you stand politically on those frameworks, the text's theological point is that prioritizing the church's energy on political transformation or worldly definitions of social justice misses the mark entirely, because our citizenship is in heaven. The church is not called to fix the geopolitical map. The church is called to preach the gospel.
The source material is adamant that the church must not confuse the eternal kingdom of Christ with any earthly political order. When a church ties its hope to a specific political party or a specific social movement, it loses its prophetic voice and its heavenly identity.
And when we understand this, we are led to what Reformed theology calls the third use of the law. Wait, let's pause there. For the listener who might not be familiar with that phrase, what does the third use of the law actually mean in plain English?
Certainly. In Reformed theology, the law of God has three primary uses. The first use is to restrain sin in society, like a bridle on a wild horse.
Makes sense.
The second use is to show us our sin and drive us to Christ for salvation, like a mirror reflecting our flaws. The third use applies specifically to those who are already saved. It means that the law of God and the truth of his providence guides the believer to walk in a way that honors him out of gratitude.
We do not obey the law to earn salvation. We obey it because we have been saved and we want to please our King.
So the doctrine of absolute providence is not supposed to make us passive or fatalistic. It is supposed to provide incredible missiological courage.
If God is absolutely sovereign over every nation, and if he has decreed the gathering of his people, then the Great Commission is a guaranteed success.
We can go into the hardest, most hostile places on earth to preach the gospel, knowing with absolute certainty that the King of Kings has already numbered the days of every hostile regime.
That reframes everything. It means the believer is entirely freed from panic. We do not need to lose our minds over elections or economic crashes or the shifting of empires.
We don't have to wring our hands when a new superpower rises or an old one falls.
Understanding God's meticulous providence results in a life marked by profound weight, marked by massive humility, because we know we are not the masters of our own destiny. It results in patience, because we know God's timing is flawless, even when it involves centuries of waiting.
And it results in courage because the ultimate victory is already secured by Christ. It completely reorients the Christian life away from worldly anxieties and anchors it in eternal realities.
The map of the world is temporary, but the kingdom of God is forever.
It truly is.
To briefly recap our progression in this deep dive today, we started by looking at God's inherent kingship authority that he holds by nature, not by human consent, like the true CEO of history.
We saw how he set the boundaries of the nations at Babel to restrain human pride.
We walked through the graphic humbling of Nebuchadnezzar's descent into a beastly state and the terrifying, immediate judgment of Belshazzar's corporate-style arrogance, proving God's absolute mastery over the greatest empires.
We traced the massive shift from a national geographic Israel to a global pilgrim church gathered entirely by gospel proclamation.
And we landed on the final, eternal, universal reign of Jesus Christ, the true Son of David. We want to reinforce to you, the listener, that every ounce of earthly majesty you see on the news is borrowed.
It is fragile, it is temporary, but the everlasting King is just. He is righteous, and his dominion will never end.
That is the immovable rock upon which the Christian faith stands. We want to leave you with a final thought to ponder long after this audio stops playing.
Something to really chew on.
If the chaotic, terrifying geopolitical headlines you read tomorrow morning are actually the precise, calculated instruments God is currently using to gather his ransomed people from every single nation. Wait, let me rephrase that. Let's think about this deeply. If those terrifying headlines are the very instruments God is using to gather his people, how does that completely alter the way you consume the news?